The sun was setting behind the wide, endless horizon when Clara stepped off the dusty stagecoach. At just 24, she had already lived through more grief than most women twice her age. Her husband, gone in a tragic ranch accident, had left her with nothing but debts and a hollow ache in her chest. She was a widow, alone, and desperate for work in a world that had little mercy for a woman with no family.
But fate always has its own way of weaving lives together.
Miles away, on the edge of the prairie, lived Samuel Hayes, a rancher in his late 30s, tall, quiet, and known to keep more company with his cattle than with people. He had carried loneliness on his shoulders for years, after losing his parents early and never daring to take a wife. Folks in town called him cold, but the truth was simpler. Samuel was a man who had never been taught how to love. The day Clara came knocking at his ranch, asking timidly if he might need help with cooking, cleaning, or even sewing, Samuel almost shut the door in her face. But something in her eyes stopped him. They weren't begging eyes, not pitying eyes, but eyes that carried the same weight he bore himself, the heavy silence of loss. Against his better judgment, he let her in.
At first, the ranch house was filled with nothing but awkward silences and polite nods. Samuel worked the land. Clara kept the house. But over time, kindness found its way into small things. She would leave hot coffee by his chair after a long ride. He would mend the door latch so the cold wind wouldn't sneak into her room. Neither admitted it, but both were healing each other's wounds in ways they didn't yet understand. Then came the spring storm. The rain poured down for days, flooding the river and threatening Samuel's cattle. He rode out in the mud, risking his life, and Clara, despite his warning, followed with a lantern to guide him back. That night, when they returned soaked and shivering, he saw her in the firelight, hair clinging to her face, her lips trembling from the cold, and for the first time in years, Samuel let down the walls around his heart. One quiet act of comfort became another, until the lines between two broken souls blurred. By summer's end, Clara carried not only Samuel's child but also his hope, the kind he thought he'd never know. But the shocking secret wasn't that she was pregnant, it was what she revealed one evening under the stars. With tears streaming down her cheeks, Clara confessed that her late husband's debts weren't just hers. They had been forced upon her by ruthless men, the kind who wouldn't hesitate to burn Samuel's ranch to the ground to collect what was owed. She had hidden it out of fear, out of shame, but now she couldn't carry the secret any longer. Samuel didn't shout. He didn't curse. Instead, he did something Clara never expected. He took her hands and said, "Then we'll face it together. You and me, and our child." That moment changed everything. The ranch was no longer just his. It was theirs. The debts were no longer hers alone. They were theirs to fight. And the child was no longer a symbol of sorrow, but of second chances. Months later, when the same men rode out demanding payment, they didn't find a frightened widow. They found a family standing tall, a rancher no longer lonely, and a woman no longer broken. Together, Samuel and Clara proved that love isn't born from wealth or perfect beginnings. It's born from kindness, courage, and the choice to stand by someone when the world says you shouldn't. And when their child was born, Samuel looked down at the tiny hand wrapped around his finger and whispered, "You saved me, little one. And so did your mother." Sometimes, the greatest love stories don't come from perfect people with perfect lives. They come from broken hearts that dared to heal together. Because love, true love, isn't about finding someone flawless. It's about finding someone willing to walk with you through the storms, and still choosing to stay. The prairie had a way of swallowing silence whole. Out there, miles from any town, where the sky stretched so wide it seemed to press down on the earth, a lonely rancher lived his days in quiet repetition. His name was Samuel Hayes. For years, he had tended his cattle, fixed his fences, and returned each evening to an empty house that had long forgotten the sound of laughter. He wasn't an unkind man, but grief had taught him to keep people at a distance. Losing his parents young, and never finding the courage to start a family of his own, left him cautious, worn down, and resigned to solitude. Folks in town called him hard, but the truth was much sadder. Samuel was simply alone. And then came Clara. She was only 24, but already carried the weary eyes of a widow. Her husband had died suddenly in a ranch accident, leaving her with debts she couldn't pay and a heart heavy with loss. When the stagecoach left her at the edge of Samuel's property, she had nothing more than a small bag, a worn dress, and the faint hope that someone might give her a chance. The world was not kind to a young widow with no family. Jobs were scarce, money scarcer. But Clara was determined not to collapse under the weight of her circumstances. When she knocked on Samuel's door, asking if he might need help cooking, sewing, or anything a woman's hands could manage, Samuel almost turned her away. He was used to the quiet, and strangers unsettled him. But something in her voice stopped him. It wasn't desperation, though her need was clear. It was dignity. Clara wasn't begging. She was offering what she could, determined to stand on her own 2 feet. Samuel studied her for a long moment, and though his instincts told him to retreat, he found himself nodding. That simple choice changed everything. At first, life together on the ranch was filled with silence. Samuel worked the land, his back bent under the sun. Clara kept the house, her hands busy from dawn until dusk. They spoke little, offering only polite thanks and short answers. But slowly, something tender began to grow. She noticed how he left his boots by the door, always cleaned and lined up, a small order in a world of chaos. He noticed how she hummed softly when she cooked, an absent melody that filled the rooms with warmth. The house, once empty, began to feel lived in. The silence, once suffocating, became companionable. One evening, after a long day of work, Samuel returned to find a cup of coffee waiting by his chair. Clara didn't say anything, just offered a quiet smile. It was a small act, but for a man who had long stopped expecting kindness, it cut deep. He found himself fixing the broken door latch the next day so the cold wind wouldn't creep into her room. He told himself it was nothing, just necessary repairs. But deep down, he knew it was more than that, it was care. Then came the storm. The kind that turns rivers wild and skies black. For days, rain poured without end. The river swelled, threatening Samuel's cattle. He rode out into the mud and water, determined to save what he could. Clara, despite his warnings, followed with a lantern, her small figure fighting against the wind. When he finally returned, soaked and exhausted, there she was at the door, her hair plastered to her face, shivering but unyielding. In the firelight, something shifted. Samuel saw her not as a burden, not as a stranger, but as someone who had risked herself to make sure he found his way home. That night, as they sat by the fire, warmth spread not just from the flames but from something unspoken between them. One moment of comfort led to another, until their walls gave way. Love did not arrive with grand declarations but with quiet acts, with the kind of closeness born from survival and trust. By summer's end, Clara carried Samuel's child. What began as 2 broken souls crossing paths had become something far greater, a family in the making. But Clara carried a secret, one she had buried under her resolve. One evening, as the stars stretched across the endless sky, she broke. With tears in her eyes, she confessed that the debts left by her late husband were not gone. Ruthless men had pressed them onto her shoulders, men who would not hesitate to come after her, even here. She feared they would ruin Samuel, burn his ranch, destroy the fragile life they were building. Samuel listened in silence. Clara braced herself for anger, for blame, for rejection. But instead, Samuel reached for her trembling hands and spoke words she never expected. "Then we'll face it together. You and me, and our child." That moment became a turning point. The ranch was no longer Samuel's alone. The debts were no longer Clara's burden. Their lives were tied together, not out of necessity but out of choice. Samuel had lived years believing he was destined to walk through life alone, but now he had something worth fighting for. Clara had believed she was cursed to bear grief and shame, but now she had someone who chose her, not despite her scars but because of them. When the men eventually came to collect what they claimed was owed, they didn't find a frightened widow. They found Samuel Hayes, standing firm, his arm around Clara, his voice steady as he declared that no one would threaten his family. The rancher who had once been known for silence found his strength in protecting the people he loved. The men left that day, realizing this wasn't a fight they could win. Months later, Clara gave birth to a child who carried both their hopes. Samuel, holding the tiny hand wrapped around his finger, felt something he had never known before: peace. He whispered to the child, "You saved me, little one. And so did your mother." The story of Samuel and Clara is not one of perfection. It is a story of wounds and scars, of mistakes and secrets, but also of kindness and courage. They didn't rescue each other with grand gestures. They rescued each other with persistence, with faith, with the simple choice to stay. And in the end, that is the truth about love. It isn't about flawless beginnings or fairy tale endings. It's about two broken souls daring to heal together. It's about kindness when the world is cruel. It's about standing side by side when storms come, and choosing, again and again, not to walk away. Samuel Hayes, the lonely rancher, was no longer alone. Clara, the young widow, was no longer abandoned by fate. Together, they built a life where there was once only loss. And their child became proof that sometimes, even out of the deepest sorrow, something beautiful and lasting can grow. Because love, real love, is not just about passion or perfection. It is about choosing someone every day, no matter the storms, no matter the past. It is about kindness, forgiveness, and the strength to start again. And in that truth lies the reason their story continues to inspire.